I am Marcus Holloway, 38 years old, living in a renovated brick townhouse in Brookmere, Ohio. The kind of place with exposed beams and carefully restored hardwood floors that we once picked out together on a rainy Saturday afternoon, convincing ourselves that this house was proof we were building something permanent, something solid, something that would outlast whatever temporary storms life decided to throw at us. And for 5 years I've been married to Lauren Mitchell, 30. A marketing manager at a startup called Bright Path Media, a company she used to describe as chaotic but exciting, unpredictable but full of potential. And on the night of March 12th, she came home acting like she had memorized her lines in front of a mirror, her movements controlled, her tone measured, her smile forced into something that never quite reached her eyes. I remember the exact way the front door closed, not slammed, but eased shut, as if she did not want to disturb the air too much, and how she placed her purse on the entry table with deliberate care, lining it up at the edge, as though symmetry mattered more than whatever was about to happen. And when she walked into the living room where I was sitting on the couch with my laptop open, she did not sit next to me the way she normally did, but remained standing for a second too long before saying that we needed to talk, her voice steady in a way that felt rehearsed rather than emotional. She told me she needed a week to herself to think about her life and who she really was, that she had been feeling overwhelmed, that her coworkers had been discussing how healthy couples sometimes take breaks to reassess and grow independently, that it was not about me, but about her needing space to reflect. And as she spoke, I noticed how she kept twisting her wedding ring around her finger, not absent-mindedly, but rhythmically, like a physical outlet for something she was trying to suppress. And from the first second I saw her avoid eye contact, glancing past me instead of at me, I knew this was not spontaneous, not some impulsive emotional reaction to a bad day at work. There was a distance in her posture that had not existed before, a careful neutrality in her phrasing that sounded less like a woman searching for clarity and more like someone presenting a decision that had already been made, something she had already emotionally committed to long before walking through her front door. And while she framed it as a temporary pause, a harmless week apart to clear her head, the energy in the room felt final, like the slow closing of a door that had been creaking shut for months without me fully noticing. She referenced conversations at Bright Path Media about personal fulfillment and boundaries, about how modern relationships require flexibility and space, about how clinging too tightly can suffocate growth. And as she repeated these borrowed philosophies, I realized none of it sounded like her own language. It sounded curated, filtered through group chats and office lunches and self-help podcasts. And I sat there listening to my wife explain our marriage back to me, as if it were a case study she had analyzed with colleagues over coffee. What unsettled me most was not the request for a week apart, but the composure with which she delivered it, the absence of visible doubt, the way she seemed prepared for every possible reaction. And when I asked her if there was someone else, she shook her head almost too quickly, dismissing the idea without engaging with it, saying this was about self-discovery, about finding herself outside the structure of US. And yet her hands never stopped circling that ring, as if she were already practicing the motion of taking it off. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me, not explosive anger or dramatic heartbreak, but a quiet, creeping awareness that whatever was happening had started long before March 12th. That while I believed we were simply navigating ordinary stress, she had been mapping an exit route in her mind, testing the idea of distance, gauging how it would feel to step away. And as I watched her stand in our carefully renovated living room, illuminated by the soft yellow light we once chose together because it felt warm and intimate, I understood that this conversation was not the beginning of uncertainty, but the unveiling of a decision she had already made. Instead of arguing or raising my voice the way she may have expected, I stayed seated for a moment and let the silence stretch between us. Then I calmly asked her what exactly she needed to think about, because phrases like space and clarity sound profound until you actually ask someone to define them. And at first she defaulted to the same rehearsed language about personal growth and emotional recalibration, and how sometimes people lose themselves inside long-term relationships. But I did not let her hide behind abstractions, and I kept my tone steady as I pressed for specifics, telling her that if she wanted distance, then at least I deserved honesty about what that distance was meant to solve. That was when something in her composure flickered and she finally admitted that she was unsure about everything, including us. And the way she said including us landed heavier than any dramatic accusation ever could have, because it stripped away the illusion that this was about workplace stress or burnout or some temporary identity crisis, and revealed what it truly was: doubt about our marriage itself, doubt about the life we had built, doubt about whether she wanted to remain my wife. And hearing that from someone I had stood beside for 5 years felt less like a stab and more like a slow tightening in my chest. a realization that I had been standing on ground that was already cracking beneath my feet. In that moment, I understood something with painful clarity, that if my own wife was uncertain about being married to me, then no amount of pleading or emotional theatrics would restore certainty, and I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Not because I was unaffected, but because I refused to degrade myself by competing for loyalty that should have been freely given. And I made a decision right there in our living room that I would not beg. I would not negotiate for scraps of affection. And I would not position myself as an applicant interviewing for the role of husband in my own marriage. I stood up, walked past her without brushing against her, and told her in a voice that surprised even me with how level it sounded that if she truly needed space to figure out whether she wanted to be married, then she could have all the space she wanted, not just 7 days, but indefinitely, because a week was not going to manufacture conviction where doubt had already taken root. And if she required absence to determine the value of our life together, then I was not going to limit that absence to a convenient timeline that would make her feel less accountable. Her eyes widened slightly, as if she had anticipated resistance, maybe even expected me to argue or promise to change or insist on counseling. But instead I walked upstairs into our bedroom, opened the closet we had organized side by side years ago, and pulled out one of her suitcases from the top shelf, placing it on the bed with deliberate precision before unzipping it and beginning to fold her clothes with mechanical focus, selecting essentials first: jeans, sweaters, undergarments, toiletries from the bathroom cabinet, each item placed carefully inside, as if I were packing for a long trip rather than a temporary retreat. She followed me upstairs and stood near the doorway watching in stunned silence as I moved efficiently through drawers and shelves. And I could feel her confusion in the air, because this was not the script she had prepared for. She had likely imagined tears or anger or desperate bargaining, not this quiet compliance that treated her request as literal and consequential. And when she finally spoke, saying that I was overreacting and that she only meant a short break, I did not stop packing. I simply reminded her that uncertainty about everything, including us, was not a minor fluctuation, but a fundamental fracture. The room felt different as I zipped the suitcase closed, heavier and stripped of its familiarity, and I realized that by taking her words at face value and acting on them without protest, I had shifted the balance of power in a way she had not anticipated. Because I was no longer asking to be chosen, I was allowing her the freedom to walk away without obstruction. And in doing so, I made it clear that my self-respect would not be negotiated, even if it meant standing alone in the house we once believed was permanent. As I continued packing her suitcase with deliberate precision, I felt something inside me shift from shock into clarity, and I realized that this conversation had not emerged from nowhere, but had been building quietly for months, in subtle behavioral changes I had noticed but chosen not to confront. Late nights at the office that stretched from occasional overtime into routine absences, vague explanations about client dinners that lacked specifics, the way she began placing her phone face down on the table whenever it lit up, and how she would angle the screen away from me, even during ordinary scrolling. Small gestures that by themselves might have meant nothing, but together formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I told her that this was not sudden for me, that I had watched her grow emotionally distant, that the warmth in her voice had cooled, that conversations which once flowed easily now felt transactional, and that whenever I tried to ask if something was wrong, she would become defensive in a way that made me feel like the aggressor for simply noticing the shift. And she immediately accused me of twisting her words and overanalyzing normal stress, claiming that I was building a narrative in my head to justify my reaction. But her eyes betrayed her composure, and there was a tremor in her breathing that contradicted the calm tone she was trying to maintain. I stopped folding clothes and faced her directly, standing in the middle of the bedroom we once arranged together, and I asked her plainly whether she was unsure about staying married to me, not about stress or work or personal growth, but about the actual commitment we had made to each other. And for a moment she said nothing, her jaw tightening, her fingers gripping the edge of the dresser as if bracing herself, and then she whispered maybe, barely audible yet devastatingly clear. That single word carried more truth than all her rehearsed explanations combined. And in that instant I understood that this was not about rediscovering herself, but about testing the waters of a life without me, about seeing whether I would scramble to fix myself to fit whatever narrative she had constructed about her shortcomings, about whether I would panic and promise change and fight to re-qualify for a position I already held. And I felt something almost liberating in recognizing that I would not play that role. I resumed packing without another argument, placing the last of her belongings into the suitcase and zipping it closed with a finality that echoed louder than any raised voice could have. And when I lifted it from the bed, I felt the weight of more than fabric and toiletries. I felt the accumulated months of unspoken tension and quiet suspicion. The slow erosion of certainty that she had tried to disguise as personal evolution. I carried the suitcase downstairs, and she followed a few steps behind, her composure now visibly cracking as the reality of the situation settled in. And when we reached the front door, I set the suitcase beside her and told her calmly that if she needed space to decide whether she wanted to be married, then she was free to take it. But if she ever decided she wanted to come back, she would need to convince me, not the other way around, because I would not beg for someone to choose me when they were uncertain about my worth. Her eyes filled with tears, as if she had expected resistance and received resolve instead, and she stood there for a moment searching my face for some sign of desperation, some flicker of fear that would validate her leverage. But I gave her none, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. And when she finally picked up the suitcase, her hands trembled in a way they had not earlier that evening, the rehearsed confidence gone, replaced by a dawning realization that I was not going to collapse in her absence. She stepped outside into the cool March night, the porch light casting a soft glow against the brick facade of the townhouse we once called our shared future. And as she walked down the path toward her car, she was crying openly, clearly unprepared for a husband who chose self-respect over desperation. And when the door closed behind her, the silence that followed felt less like abandonment and more like the beginning of clarity. After she left, the house felt brutally honest in a way it never had before, stripped of the illusion of warmth and shared purpose. Every room suddenly revealing how quiet it had actually been for months. And I stood there in the living room staring at the front door long after her car pulled away, letting the silence settle into the walls, as if it had been waiting for permission to exist. The air felt different, not emptier but clearer, as though tension I had subconsciously ignored was no longer being disguised by routine. And when I finally turned back toward the couch, I noticed the laptop she had forgotten on the coffee table, still open, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. For a moment, I considered closing it without looking, preserving whatever dignity remained in the situation, but something inside me refused to accept half-truths any longer. And when I reached down to shut it off, a notification preview caught my eye, a name I did not recognize at first, Jason Reed, and beneath it a fragment of a message that did not read like professional correspondence. My chest tightened as I sat down and touched the trackpad, the screen unlocking without resistance because she had not even bothered to log out, and what unfolded in front of me was not a single incriminating exchange, but months of conversation layered gradually from mundane to intimate. At first the messages were harmless, work-related discussions about campaigns and deadlines and client feedback, light jokes about office chaos and shared frustrations. But as I scrolled further back, the tone shifted almost imperceptibly, emojis appearing where formal punctuation once existed, compliments about her creativity that extended beyond professional admiration, inside jokes that implied private conversations, and then the emotional undertone grew unmistakable, late-night exchanges that had nothing to do with marketing strategies and everything to do with how she felt misunderstood at home, how she sometimes questioned whether she had rushed into marriage, how she felt trapped in a life that looked perfect on the outside but left her restless on the inside. I saw my name appear not with affection but with analysis, my habits dissected in paragraphs that painted me as distant and rigid, complaints about my focus on structure and routine, statements about how she feared becoming someone's wife more than becoming herself. And Jason's responses were not neutral or detached, but validating, carefully crafted to reinforce her dissatisfaction, telling her she deserved to feel alive, that she was too vibrant to feel confined, that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is step outside what is safe. The further I read, the more the timeline aligned with the behavioral changes I had noticed, the guarded phone, the defensive tone, the late nights justified as brainstorming sessions. And then I reached the message from the day before she asked for space. A line from him that felt less like suggestion and more like invitation. His apartment was always open, and it was time to see what else was out there, followed by her response that she was scared but excited, that she needed a week to think, and that after that everything might look different. In that moment, the final piece fell into place with a clarity that was almost clinical. Her request for a week alone was not an abstract quest for self-discovery, but a calculated trial run, a controlled experiment, where she could explore another man's presence, while keeping me positioned as a fallback option in case the new possibility failed to meet expectations. And the calm she had displayed earlier that night was no longer mysterious, but strategic. She had already secured a temporary landing spot before informing me she intended to jump. I closed the laptop slowly, not in rage, but in confirmation, and sat back against the couch feeling neither shocked nor hysterical, but resolute, because the narrative she had attempted to present about growth and clarity had collapsed under the weight of her own words, and the house that moments earlier felt brutally honest now felt definitive, as if it had just witnessed the unmasking of a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for months. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had refused to fully shut down, and when I reached for my phone on nightstand, I saw a wall of notifications from Lauren, message after message stacked on top of each other, as if urgency alone could rewrite what had happened the night before. She said she had overreacted, that she was emotional and confused, that leaving had been impulsive, that she missed me already, that she did not want to lose what we had built, and the shift in tone from controlled attachment to frantic attachment was almost jarring in its speed. The woman who had calmly requested space to figure out whether she wanted to remain married was now insisting that she could not imagine life without me. And the contradiction did not feel romantic or reassuring, but strategic. Her messages were filled with softened language, calling me by the nickname she had not used in months, referencing memories from early in our relationship, saying she was scared and just needed reassurance, framing the entire situation as a misunderstanding fueled by stress. But what stood out most was what she did not mention. Not once did she bring up Jason Reed. Not once did she acknowledge the months of conversations I had read word for word the night before, and the omission was louder than any apology could have been. Around mid-morning my phone rang, and the caller ID displayed Megan Harper, her older sister, 39, someone who had always presented herself as the rational mediator in family disputes, and the moment I answered I was met with accusation rather than inquiry. She told me that Lauren had arrived in tears claiming I had thrown her out, that I had packed her bags in anger and forced her to leave, that she was blindsided and heartbroken, and the narrative being described bore little resemblance to what had actually transpired. I listened without interrupting, letting Megan finish her version of events, and when she paused expecting my defense to come in the form of emotional justification, I simply told her I would send her something that might clarify the situation. I forwarded screenshots of the messages between Lauren and Jason, carefully selected exchanges that demonstrated the progression from workplace familiarity to emotional intimacy, the complaints about feeling trapped in marriage, the validation from him encouraging her to explore other possibilities, and finally the message from the day before she asked for space stating that his apartment was always open and it was time to see what else was out there. I did not add commentary or embellishment. I let the words speak for themselves because they required no interpretation beyond basic reading comprehension. There was a noticeable delay after I sent them, no immediate response, just silence that felt heavier than Megan's earlier indignation. And when she finally called back, her tone had shifted completely, stripped of certainty and edged with something closer to disbelief. She admitted that Lauren had not mentioned any of this, that she had framed the situation as a suffocating marriage and an overbearing husband, that she had positioned herself as someone seeking temporary clarity rather than someone orchestrating a trial separation backed by emotional infidelity. Megan's voice carried frustration now, not toward me but toward her sister, and she acknowledged that she had been misled into defending a version of events that was incomplete at best and intentionally deceptive at worst. By early afternoon the dynamic had changed entirely, and Lauren's texts grew more erratic, oscillating between apology and defensiveness, claiming the messages were harmless, insisting nothing physical had happened, arguing that emotional connection did not equate to betrayal, but the foundation of her victim narrative had already collapsed. Megan informed me that she had confronted Lauren with the screenshots, and that the explanations did not hold up under scrutiny, and instead of offering continued refuge without conditions, she had given Lauren a clear deadline to find her own place rather than enabling a distorted story that cast me as the villain. Sitting in the quiet of the townhouse, phone resting in my hand, I realized how quickly the truth recalibrated perception once exposed, and how fragile a fabricated narrative becomes when confronted with documented evidence. And for the first time since March 12th, I felt not reactive but grounded, aware that the situation had shifted not because I argued louder, but because I refused to let omission masquerade as innocence. I eventually called Lauren because I had no interest in letting this spiral through secondhand conversations and carefully edited text messages. And when she answered, her voice sounded fragile but defensive, as if she had already prepared to redirect the conversation away from the one topic she knew could not be explained with vague language. I told her I had read the messages between her and Jason Reed, and for a split second there was silence on the line before she pivoted, accusing me of violating her privacy, saying I had no right to go through her laptop, framing my discovery as the real betrayal, and the deflection was almost predictable in its structure. I did not raise my voice or justify how the laptop had been left open on our coffee table. I simply repeated that the issue was not access but content, and that months of emotional intimacy with another man did not disappear just because she wanted to focus on how I found out. She insisted at first that it was harmless, that it was just work stress spilling over into conversation, that I was reading too much into it. But when I quoted specific lines back to her, lines about feeling trapped, about craving excitement, about his apartment always being open and it being time to see what else was out there, her explanations began to lose structure. Eventually, her tone shifted from denial to reluctant acknowledgement, and she admitted that they had grown emotionally close, that she enjoyed the attention, that Jason made her feel noticed in ways she had not felt in a while, that he complimented her constantly and validated frustrations she had not voiced to me, and she said she liked feeling desired and interesting again, as if those emotions justified the secrecy required to cultivate them. She framed it as something that had developed gradually, something she had not intended. But intent felt irrelevant when the pattern was deliberate and sustained over time. I asked her directly whether she had planned to sleep with him during her so-called week of space, and the silence that followed was heavier than any answer could have been. She did not respond immediately, and in that pause I could hear her breathing shift, hear the calculation in her restraint, and when she finally spoke she said she had not decided yet, that she was confused, that she did not know what she wanted, but the hesitation itself was the truth without needing explicit confirmation. A person fully committed to their marriage does not need to deliberate over whether intimacy with someone else is an option, and the fact that she had to consider it at all told me everything. In that moment, I understood the structure of what she had attempted to do. She had not asked for space to heal or reflect. She had asked for permission to explore a potential replacement while keeping the safety net of our marriage intact in case the experiment failed. The week apart was never neutral ground. It was a trial run, a chance to test chemistry and compatibility without formally ending what we had, so that if Jason did not measure up, she could return under the banner of self-discovery and expect reconciliation. There was something almost clinical about the clarity I felt then, not explosive rage, but a steady realization that I had been positioned as a contingency plan, an insurance policy against uncertainty, and when she tried to soften her words by saying she still loved me and did not want to lose me, it sounded less like devotion and more like risk management. The truth was not in what she promised, but in what she had been willing to consider. And the image of her weighing whether to cross that final line while still wearing my wedding ring was enough to strip away any lingering doubt about where I stood in her hierarchy of priorities. 2 days later, just as the emotional turbulence had settled into something colder and more controlled, there was a knock on my door that I did not expect, and when I opened it I found Jason Reed standing on my porch, 41 years old, dressed in business casual like he had just left the office, but without the polished confidence I imagined he carried at Bright Path Media. Because in that moment he looked visibly uncomfortable, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped together as if rehearsing an apology he was not sure how to deliver. He introduced himself unnecessarily, his voice lower than I anticipated, and said he thought it would be better to speak face-to-face rather than let things spiral further. And I stepped aside without offering hospitality, letting him enter the living room that had become the stage for this unraveling. He did not sit until I did, and even then he perched on the edge of the couch like someone aware he was trespassing in more ways than one. He began by insisting that nothing physical had happened between him and Lauren, that their connection had remained emotional, that lines had been approached but not crossed. And I watched him carefully, not searching for guilt but for consistency. And while I had no interest in believing him for his benefit, I sensed he was telling the truth about at least that part. He admitted that the dynamic had escalated faster than he expected, that he had been flattered by the attention just as she had been, that the validation felt intoxicating, especially given that his own previous marriage had ended under similar circumstances involving blurred emotional boundaries at work. He said that when Lauren told him I had packed her suitcase and refused to fight for her the way she anticipated, something shifted for him, that he realized he was stepping into a pattern he had already lived through, one that had cost him a marriage and significant professional fallout, and he claimed he ended things immediately once he saw the situation clearly. According to him, Lauren did not take that rejection quietly. And instead of accepting his withdrawal, she began calling and messaging repeatedly, oscillating between anger and desperation, accusing him of abandoning her after encouraging her to question her marriage, and even suggesting that if he distanced himself at work, she would escalate complaints to human resources about inappropriate conduct. As he spoke, a different layer of clarity formed in my mind, because this was no longer just about an emotional affair born out of dissatisfaction. It was about control, about someone whose fantasy had collapsed unexpectedly, and who was now scrambling to regain leverage in whatever direction she could. He admitted that he felt responsible for allowing the intimacy to develop, that he should have shut it down earlier. But But he was firm in saying he had no intention of pursuing anything further, not professionally and not personally, because he recognized the volatility of the situation and the damage it could cause. Listening to him was not cathartic, and it was not enraging either. It was grounding, because it confirmed what I had already sensed, that Lauren had constructed a narrative in which she could test an alternative while preserving the safety of return. But when I refused to panic and he refused to proceed, the structure collapsed under its own instability. The desperation in her messages, the sudden pivot from independence to reconciliation, the attempt to reframe herself as abandoned rather than accountable, all of it aligned with what he described. When he stood to leave, there was an awkward pause, not between rivals but between two men who had seen the same situation from different angles and recognized its consequences, and after he walked out and the door closed behind him, I did not feel vindicated or victorious. I felt settled. That conversation cemented something inside me that had been forming since the night she asked for space. That this was no longer about salvaging a marriage built on conditional loyalty, but about protecting my dignity from becoming collateral damage in someone else's indecision. Within 3 weeks of that final conversation with Jason, any lingering hesitation I might have carried dissolved into something practical and deliberate, and I scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney whose office overlooked the courthouse downtown, sitting across from him in a leather chair while he outlined timelines and paperwork with the detached efficiency of someone accustomed to watching marriages unravel into legal documents. There were no children to complicate custody, no shared business ventures or tangled investment portfolios, only the townhouse and a handful of joint accounts that could be divided without theatrical courtroom battles. And the simplicity of the process felt almost ironic given how emotionally convoluted the preceding weeks had been. I signed the paperwork without shaking hands or second thoughts, and by early summer the divorce was finalized, reduced to signatures and stamps that officially ended what once felt permanent. The administrative side of it moved quickly, perhaps because neither of us had the energy left to fight, and when the final decree arrived in the mail, I experienced neither triumph nor devastation, only a quiet confirmation that a chapter had closed exactly where it had begun to fracture, not in some explosive betrayal, but in that calm, rehearsed request for space that had exposed everything beneath it. Life adjusted around the absence in ways both subtle and undeniable, routines reshaped, furniture rearranged, silence no longer heavy but neutral, and I focused on maintaining stability rather than replaying hypotheticals that no longer mattered. Late in the summer, I ran into Lauren unexpectedly at a grocery store near Riverton Heights, the neighborhood where I had heard she moved into a smaller apartment complex, and for a moment we both froze beside the produce section like strangers recognizing a familiar face from a past life. She looked different, not dramatically altered but diminished somehow, her posture slightly collapsed, dark circles under her eyes that makeup could not fully conceal, and there was an exhaustion about her that went beyond lack of sleep, as if the weight of miscalculation had settled into her bones. We exchanged restrained greetings, and she told me she had quit her job at Bright Path Media because the office environment became unbearable after rumors circulated about her connection with Jason, that colleagues who once encouraged her independence now distanced themselves, that what had felt like empowerment in theory turned corrosive in practice, and she spoke with a mixture of defensiveness and regret, acknowledging that things had spiraled beyond what she anticipated. She said she missed the stability we had, that she had been confused and influenced, that she had mistaken attention for clarity, and eventually her voice softened into a question about whether we could ever try again, whether too much damage had truly been done. I listened without interrupting, aware that the version of her standing in front of me was not the composed woman who asked for space, but someone confronting the consequences of choices that did not unfold as she imagined. And I answered calmly that I would rather be alone than married to someone who saw me as an option rather than a choice. Because once loyalty becomes conditional, rebuilding it requires more than apology. It requires a certainty that had already proven fragile. I told her I did not hate her, but I could not unknow what I knew or unsee the hesitation that had preceded everything. And as I walked away, pushing my cart toward the checkout line, I felt no urge to look back. The moment she asked for space had been the moment she revealed she was already halfway gone, and the divorce had not created that distance, but merely formalized it. And leaving the store that afternoon, I understood that closure does not always arrive with drama. Sometimes it arrives in the simple recognition that self-respect once chosen cannot be negotiated away again.